Hi everyone, my name is Annie Nanavaji and I'm the president of the Columbia University College Republicans. Thank you so much for coming tonight. Before we get started, I would like to thank the Young Americas Foundation for the sponsorship and support that made this event possible. Challenging the many different viewpoints of our peers on campus is so important and vital for our intellectual growth. Dinesh D'Souza has had a 25-year career as an author, scholar, political commentator, and filmmaker. D'Souza served as a policy analyst in the Reagan White House, John M. Olin Fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, and Robert and Karen Rishwain Fellow at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University. He has also served as the president of the King's College in New York City. D'Souza's first book, Illiberal Education, in 1991, became a New York Times bestseller and has been listed as one of the most influential books of the 1990s. He has been a major influencer on public policy ever since. D'Souza has published many more best-selling books, each unique and inspiring in different ways. But the common theme of them all is their ability to speak for the conservative movement by celebrating conservative heroes and ideas and presenting new narratives that have driven liberals crazy. D'Souza's latest work is a documentary film and book, both entitled Hillary's America: The Secret History of the Democratic Party. The film was the highest-grossing documentary of 2016. Now please join me in welcoming Dinesh D'Souza.
Hey guys, really glad to be here. Sorry we're starting a little bit late. It turns out that there's a bunch of people outside who have been trying to get in, but they're apparently not on an invitation list, and so the university won't let them in. So it's too bad, but you're here. I'm glad you're here. And this couldn't be a more interesting and auspicious time to be speaking at an elite Ivy League university, because for me, this is a time of great intellectual and political confusion and tumult. I must say that it's been now 3.5 months since the election, and the shock, and for some people the elation, for others the dismay, and astonishment at the outcome has not in any way subsided. Trump's election was stunning because it was actually achieved against what seemed to be insurmountable odds. Hillary had the money, she had the organization, she had the strong support of the technological sector, the media, Hollywood, academia, and the Republican Party was in a kind of civil war over Trump. And still he won. How he won is actually a very interesting question. The voters who put Trump over the top are none other than the working class Democrats. In the 80s, I'm a creature of the 80s, we used to call them the Reagan Democrats. And Republicans have been trying to get those voters for a generation now. By and large, Republicans have been trying to win the Reagan Democrats, the working class Democrats, by appealing to social issues. The idea is that these guys are pretty conservative on issues of patriotism. They're conservative on issues of immigration. And so Republicans have been trying to win that vote unsuccessfully since 1984. Trump realized that the way to win those voters is to appeal to them on economic and social issues. We have seen a massive convulsion in this country over the past 30 years. It's been driven economically by three factors: globalization, technology, and immigration. And the combined effect of those three things has been to depress working class wages downward, or at least leave them stagnant. The Democratic Party has done nothing about any of those three issues. In fact, to the degree it has had a policy, it has been to loosen, to liberalize immigration, to put further downward pressure on working class wages. And moreover, for the white working class, there is no place in the liberal multicultural tent. The liberal multicultural tent is mobilized as a coalition of ethnic groups against the white male. And so for the Democratic Party to win white male votes is basically to invite whites into a tent and a totem pole in which they get to play the whipping boy. Not surprisingly, the white working class said, no, thank you. And Trump pulled off what is actually a very decisive victory. Now, since Trump won, the level of disbelief has been so great that there has been a kind of unceasing effort to minimize that victory. Trump didn't win the popular vote. This is actually a nonsensical statement. This is kind of like saying that in a tennis match where Federer beat Nadal by 3-2, and even though the score was 6-4, 6-4, 0-6, 1-6, 6-4, that somehow Nadal deserves the title because he won more overall points. But that's not the rule of the game. That's not what our Constitution says. That's not the agreed upon framework in which the election is conducted. And the very unprecedented efforts to recount even in states that were not close, and then to persuade electors to vote against the candidate to which they were pledged, and then the disruption of the inauguration. I mean, this may all seem rather normal, but I have to say to you, if Republicans had done this to Obama, try to imagine the reaction across the country, in the media, etc. The idea of not only saying, I disagree with the outcome, but I'm going to go and break up the party. I'm going to disrupt the ceremony. I'm going to act as if this is an illegitimate president. And here we kind of get to the heart of the issue, because since even before the election, Hillary and leading Democrats were conveying the idea that somehow Trump is illegitimate. He is beyond the pale. He's outside the sort of acceptable orbit of American politics. And I think some of the particularly more aggressive, disruptive, and in some cases violent protests that we've seen, not just in Washington, D.C., but on the campus, here in New York, at Berkeley, very strange phenomena. If you saw the Berkeley protests, you have masked protesters in black outfits, looking in a sense like stormtroopers, using threats and force to prevent a speaker from speaking on campus. Now, you might ask, what possible justification can there be on a campus of all places? In other words, an environment dedicated to knowledge. And one would think that if one is going to allow free speech, the widest possible amplitude should be on the campus. Why? Because the campus is actually shelved off from the larger society, precisely in order to allow this kind of argument and debate and kind of consideration of issues that may be beyond the pale. So it's not just that you have a protest, but you have protesters who feel morally licensed to disrupt. And what interests me is the question of, where does that moral indignation come from? Where does this willingness to sort of trample on free speech come from? And the answer is, it comes from the 1960s. In the 1960s, there was a slogan that was invented at Berkeley. It's associated with the scholar Herbert Marcuse of the so-called Frankfurt School. And it was called repressive tolerance. Repressive tolerance. More colloquially, no free speech for fascists. Now, what does this mean? Put in the simple terms, what it means is tolerance is a good thing. But we on the left who are tolerant do not need to be tolerant of the intolerant. So therefore, if we can find a group that we can dub intolerant, tolerance goes out the window. We are then allowed to block them by any means necessary. Marcuse, by the way, was, along with some of the other guys from the Frankfurt School, they were originally refugees from Nazi Germany. They grew up in Germany in the early days of Hitler. And then they fled Germany and they came to the United States. And in a sense, their arguments came out of that Nazi experience. Now, when we talk about the Nazis, we're not talking about the Nazis of the Holocaust, the post-World War II understanding of the Nazis. We're talking about when the Nazis first came to power. When the Nazis first came to power, there was a kind of breakdown of civility in Weimar Germany. And Mussolini, and in Italy, not just in Germany, Mussolini says that he would go out with a group of his black shirts, and they would carry baseball bats, or the equivalent of baseball bats, and the socialists would show up, and street fights would break out between the fascists and the socialists. Now, fleeing from Germany to America, Marcuse, in a sense, argued that America and American capitalism resembles Nazi Germany. And so what he was saying to the activists of the 60s was, you guys are just like the people fighting Hitler. And if you're fighting against Hitler, you don't need to debate with him. You don't need to argue. You don't need to listen respectfully to his point of view. Your job is to stop him. And if you stop him, look at all the horrors you would have prevented. And that argument is displaced now and here to America in 2017 under the idea that Trump is essentially another Mussolini. He's another Hitler. So I actually want to address this issue of Hitler, of Nazism, of fascism, of bigotry very frontally. And address it in an audience where I think the answer to the question matters a great deal. Is Trump actually a kind of Mussolini? Is he a kind of a Hitler? I will admit, having seen old grainy photographs of Mussolini from the 20s and 30s, that if Trump crosses his arms and looks to the left and kind of puts on a trademark pout, he does look a bit like Mussolini. I'm told on reliable authority that he really likes Italian food. But probing this issue a little bit deeper, what is it about Trump that makes him Mussolini? Trump is a nationalist. Trump is a militarist. Trump is a racist and a bigot. First of all, the issues of nationalism and the issue of militarism, extremely ambiguous, because there was nothing about the Nazis uniquely that made them nationalists. Stalin was a nationalist. Che Guevara was a nationalist. The American founders were nationalists in that they were devoted to their country. Trump is actually not a militarist. He's campaigned against the Iraq War. He has criticized even the Republican Party for interventionism. I want to zoom in on the charge that really matters, which is the charge of bigotry, of racism. And I'm happy to talk about Trump in this connection, but I actually want to make a much bigger and deeper point. The deeper point is that in American history, from the very beginning, the Democratic Party and later the progressive left has been, in this country, from its origins, the party of racism, of bigotry, of segregation, of slavery, of lynching, and of the Ku Klux Klan. This is not my opinion. This is an undisputable fact. And I want to spend a few moments laying out this fact because it sets the groundwork for what is in some ways the most amazing act of political chutzpah. The very party that created if you will, the plantation, that institutionalized segregation, that founded and perpetuated and used as a domestic terrorist arm the Ku Klux Klan, the very party that opposed the civil rights movement and blocked it, and had it been the only party, none of these laws would have passed. This is the party that is now accusing a guy from Queens, New York, who has nothing to do with any of this history, of being a bigot. This requires a certain degree of reflection. So I need to substantiate my argument first, and then I'm going to come to how this can be. How can it be, for example, that somebody who is a habitual criminal and somebody who is a murderer and a liar and a serial killer can essentially accuse the cop who arrested him of being a serial killer? That's kind of what we have. We have the political equivalent of that going on here. So let's push this for a moment in order to put some meat on these bones. Slavery, I think you know, is a very ancient institution. I'm not suggesting for 1 minute that the Democrats invented slavery. It's existed since the dawn of mankind. However, never in the history of the world has anyone developed the idea outside of the democratic South that slavery is good for the slave. In other words, everybody knows slavery is good for the master. And traditional arguments for slavery, going back to Aristotle, were that slavery is the result of necessity. You've captured the guy in war. Or Aristotle says that there's important work that needs to be done, and so you need to have some people who are willing to do it, and that's why we have slavery. The argument is, in a sense, it's the regrettable necessity of the world that some people have to do dirty work, and we may as well have slaves do it. But uniquely in America, the Democrats came up with the idea that slavery was, in the words of Democratic Senator John Calhoun, a positive good. No one has ever argued that before. Now, you might think that this is not a problem of the Democratic Party. After all, Calhoun was a senator from South Carolina, and therefore this was a Southern point of view. And I want to suggest that this is actually the heart and the cunningness of the progressive displacement of blame. The blame is displaced from the Democratic Party onto the South. The South did it. America did it. The white man did it. No. The Democratic Party in the North aggressively protected slavery and was allied with the Democratic Party in the South. The Northern Democrats fought for slavery with the same cunning zeal as Calhoun. Stephen Douglas, a senator from Illinois who was the leader of the Northern Democrats, basically says, number one, let every state decide for itself if it wants to have slavery. And Douglas made it very clear that in his framework called popular sovereignty, slavery would last forever. It would never end. And in fact, Douglas wanted slavery to spread to Mexico and South America and the United States to establish an empire of slavery extending all the way southward to eternity. This was the Northern Democrats. So the idea that the pro-slavery argument was Southern, a complete lie. Second, I think you know that most Southerners did not own slaves. I think you know that a very small minority of Southerners who fought in the Civil War owned slaves. So the secession argument was North-South, but the slavery argument never was. The slavery argument was squarely between a pro-slavery Democratic Party, North and South, and a Republican Party that was resolutely anti-slavery. And this now brings me to a rather startling fact that I'm about to assert that I would invite you to try to consider. In 1860, the year of the Civil War, no Republican owned a slave. There were, at that time in the United States, 4 million slaves. Every one of those slaves, without exception, was owned by a Democrat. Now, I want to be very clear that when I say these things, I'm not simply saying them. It's true, no one has said them before. But ever since I said this in my movie Hillary's America, for about 4 months, progressive scholars have been thrashing around to refute this statement, and have been unable to even question it. The only refutation that has been advanced to date is that somebody pointed out to me that Ulysses H. Grant inherited a slave through his mother's side. So in other words, the attempt is to refute this assertion by a single counterexample that I have refuted myself by pointing out that while true, that actually occurred when Ulysses H. Grant was a Democrat, which he was in his early career. All right. Now, you might say to me, well, Dinesh, gee, yes, thank you, we get it, but let's not go on about the antebellum crimes of the Democratic Party. That was all a rather long time ago. So I want to actually now pivot and talk about the postbellum crimes of the Democratic Party. Segregation. Every segregation law in the South, without exception, was passed by a Democratic legislature and signed by a Democratic governor. There is no counterexample to this assertion. The Ku Klux Klan was founded by a Confederate general, Nathan Bedford Forrest, along with others in Pulaski, Tennessee, in the 1860s. Less than 5 years after it was started, it was shut down by the Republicans. They outlawed it, they banned it, and there was no Ku Klux Klan. It disappeared. The Klan was then revived in the early 20th century by none other than the progressive hero Woodrow Wilson, who, by showing a pro-Ku Klux Klan movie in the White House, Birth of a Nation, a propagandistic film with the Ku Klux Klan as its hero, this resulted in a Klan revival around the country. I'm quoting Columbia's own Eric Foner from one of his books on Reconstruction. For 30 years, he says, the Ku Klux Klan was the domestic terrorist arm of the Democratic Party, end quote. That's Foner. Now, from the 1860s to now, virtually every Grand Dragon, Grand Cyclops, Grand Kleagle, Grand everything of the Klan has been a Democrat. Bull Connor, the Southern sheriff who put hoses and dogs on the civil rights protesters, a Democrat. Orville Faubus, who blocked the Arkansas schoolhouse for black children, a Democrat, mentor to Bill Clinton. I think you all know that President Truman, Hugo Black, Supreme Court Justice nominated by FDR, Robert Byrd, conscience of the Senate. Former members of the Ku Klux Klan, very active members in some cases. When Byrd died, now by the way, we're not talking about ancient history. We're not talking about even the 1960s. Byrd died in 2010. Obama and Bill Clinton went to his funeral. Bill Clinton said something very interesting. He said, don't be too hard on old Byrd for being in the Klan, because you had to be in the Klan to advance in the Democratic Party. Think about that. You had to be in the Klan. All right. Now, all of this weight of history, fact, not opinion, is actually known to progressive activists and scholars. They know about it. And so in what I regard as one of the cleverest political sleights of hand in modern American history, they have come up with an explanation for it. They'll never mention it. They'll never bring it up. But if I bring it up, and if I have them up here and up against the wall, they will finally say to me, Dinesh, you're right. We admit it. It's all true. But sometime in the 1960s, there was a big switch. The two parties switched sides. Now, first of all, in American politics, in world politics, this is unprecedented. You have two parties. It's kind of like saying, one day in America, the cops all became robbers and the robbers all became cops. I mean, it could happen, but how would it happen? Are you saying that somehow the Republican Party suddenly became the party of slavery? The party switched sides? Is that really possible? Well, it's asserted as a fact. It occurred. There was a big switch. Now, again, to the guy who's like born yesterday, looking at American politics with innocent eyes, there's a surface plausibility to this because, after all, blacks used to be Republican, and now they vote Democrat. And Republicans, the Southern whites used to be Democrats, now they vote Republicans. So again, on the surface, it looks like, hey, there's the big switch right there. But remember that the argument of the big switch isn't that political voting habits changed, but that the two parties switched because of race. The two parties switched because of race. Essentially what happened is that the racist Democrats became Republicans. The racist Democrats became Republicans. I want to address this head on. And it turns out that from a scholarly point of view, it's a very easy thing to examine because we have a really good sample size, the Dixiecrats. The Dixiecrats were racist Democrats. They were so racist that they essentially broke temporarily with the Democratic Party over segregation and civil rights. There's a whole bunch of them. And so we can look at that number and we can count how many of the racist Dixiecrats became Republicans. And it turns out that the answer is one. One. Strom Thurmond. He is the only example of a racist Dixiecrat to become a Republican. Every other racist Dixiecrat remained in the Democratic Party, in most cases died in the Democratic Party, and is to this day lionized by the Democratic Party. There are buildings in Washington, D.C., Senate buildings named after them. So, this is our actual history. The civil rights movement, more Republicans proportionally voted for it than Democrats. Think about that. The Civil Rights Act of 64, the Voting Rights Act of 65, the Fair Housing Bill of 68, in every single case, more Republicans proportionately vote for, and the opposition to those civil rights bills comes exclusively from the Democratic Party. In other words, the opposition is racist Democrats trying to block it. Had there been no Republicans, if the House and the Congress were made up solely of Democrats, none of those three laws would have passed. None of them. Now, I think it's at this point worth stepping back for a moment and looking at this not just in terms of what happened, but in terms of your own knowledge about it. This big switch I mentioned earlier, blacks didn't switch to the Republican Party in the 60s because of race. Blacks actually switched to the Democratic Party from Republican in the 1930s. Pretty interesting. In the 1930s, by common acknowledgement, the Democratic Party was the party of segregation and the Ku Klux Klan. And yet, blacks left the party of Lincoln and joined this party. Why would they do that? Well, the answer, regrettably, is that in the horrible conditions of the Great Depression, and with segregation on top of it, blacks essentially took the loaf of bread that was offered by the New Deal. New Deal programs, meager and discriminatory though they were a sufficient rationale to peel whites away from the Republican into the Democratic Party. Here's the point, it had nothing to do with race. It was entirely an economic rationale for moving from here to here. It was a better financial deal. Southern whites did not move to the Republican Party until a period continuous from the 60s through the 80s. Let's think about this for a moment. If you look at survey data, racism in the South has declined precipitously through the 20th century. I'm not saying it's gone away, but I'm saying it's declined. There's a downward graph. And as racism declines in the South, the same South becomes increasingly Republican. In other words, Republican affiliation is inversely correlated with racism going down. As the South becomes less racist, it becomes more Republican. And the South really moves over en masse in the Reagan era. Not because of race again, but because of economic opportunity, patriotism, free markets, anti-communism, and so on. Now, what I want to ask is this question. Why is it that these undisputed facts are not taught in our elite universities? Now, you could say our elite universities don't really care about race. They don't really care about these issues. They don't teach a whole lot about this stuff. People are really busy studying financial markets. But I think you know that's not true. These are colleges that are obsessed with race. These are colleges in which this is the one topic in which people are supposed to know something. And yet, the actual story about American politics is hidden. It's not just hidden from the campus, it's hidden from the culture. Now, how do you pull this off? One reason you pull this off, I think, is because the left on the campus and in Hollywood and in the media is sufficiently dominant that it is able to concoct and promote a big lie without anybody else having a big enough megaphone to say differently. In other words, there may be a guy listening who goes, that's a lie, but you don't have CBS News. You don't have NPR. You're not Michael Moore. You're not Steven Spielberg. You can't make a movie about it. So as a result, there is a way in which these falsehoods get multiplied. The second thing, which I alluded to earlier, is that the left has been able to shift the blame for its own actions onto the white man, the South, and America. America did this. America did that. Wait a minute, America didn't do it. If America did it, it would still be going on. Obviously, some Americans did it, and other Americans stopped them. So my point is, bigotry has a deep vein in American society, but it's not the founders who are to blame. And it's not the South that is to blame. It is actually a particular current, a particular party, and a particular ideology, and that's the left. Now let's take a fresh look at a guy like Trump. A guy who's raised, in a way, you may say, in this neighborhood, and by this I mean larger New York. A guy essentially who has seen America as a kind of melting pot, America as a sort of kaleidoscope of ethnicities, combined with that kind of restless striving that defines New York, a kind of ambition that is naked and forward-thrusting and entrepreneurial and meritocratic and get ahead and how do I find my place in the sun. And this isn't just Trump. This is everyone who works in investment banking. This is every lawyer in town. It's every publisher in a dog-eat-dog world of trying to publish the next huge bestseller. This is New York. And so if you want to indict Trump, you have to indict him for, in fact, he was indicted by Ted Cruz for having New York values. But New York values are not Mussolini's values or Hitler's values. There's, by the way, one notable thing worth adding about this whole business about Hitler, that the most notable thing about not only Mussolini's black shirts, but about the National Socialists in Germany, is that above all, they were socialists. They were socialists. Mussolini started out as a Marxist. He was the editor of the Socialist Journal in Italy. And so, again, on the issue of fascism, in the 1930s and 40s, fascism and Nazism were widely understood to be left-wing. They were understood that way by Mussolini, by Hitler. They were understood that way by FDR and by the New Deal. They were understood that way by reporters writing about the period. But after World War II, a very interesting thing happens. Fascism becomes right-wing. Right-wing. This, I want to suggest, is another big lie. It is essentially the result of a kind of intellectual sleight of hand in which after the war, when the horrors of National Socialism are now manifest for the world to see, it becomes imperative to move fascism into the right-wing column and pretend like it was some sort of excrescence of capitalism, that fascism was some sort of a invention of the business community. Whereas in reality, it arose out of an argument within socialism. When Marx's prophecies didn't come true in the 19th century, there was a big fight on the left. Why is it the case that this class revolution that's been predicted, the proletarian uprising that was supposed to happen in Germany, first of all, is not occurring? What happened to it? And ultimately, the socialist movement split with Lenin going one way and Mussolini going another. Lenin and Mussolini, by the way, knew each other. When Mussolini was elected, Lenin sent a telegram of congratulations. Lenin basically said, no, we now predict that socialism will erupt in poor countries. This was Lenin. Mussolini said, no, the problem for Marx is he identifies people's sentiment with class Whereas if you look around, you see that people are actually more motivated by national solidarity. In other words, people will die for France and Germany and Italy. They're not going to die for some idiotic conception of the proletariat. No one ever has and no one ever will. So out of this argument inside of socialism came two heretical variations of socialism. One essentially was Bolshevism, and the other was fascism. Now, let me bring this to a close. I want to open it to questions. We are at a moment where all of this history has kind of come back to haunt us. When I actually saw some of the scenes in the post-Trump inauguration and some of the scenes I've seen on campus lately, it actually does have a kind of disturbing echo of Weimar Germany. And by that I mean the code of the gentleman that defined American politics has broken down. And there's such a deep vein of distrust on both sides. Had Hillary won the election, the Trump people would have felt cheated. And there's a belligerency on both sides that is reminiscent of Mussolini showing up with baseball bats or brick bats and the opposition doing the same. The question I want to ask is, where does the historical, if you will, weight, blame, onus really lie? And what is the role of the campus in all of this? Is it really healthy in a place like Columbia to have such a unanimity of perspective in which the kinds of things that I've been saying, now it could be, I haven't spoken in Columbia in many years. It could well be that everything I've said is like ho-hum. You've heard it all before. You know it all. But if that's not true, if actually you were like, really? What? That's absurd, ridiculous. I've got to go check that out. If you've had any of those feelings, then you know that what I've actually said runs against the grain. It certainly runs against the grain in every other campus. And so my point is it healthy in a place like Columbia for these kinds of arguments which should be had out, which lie at the very, we're not talking about racial epithets, we're not talking about political correctness, we're not talking about people feeling unsafe, we're talking about substantive arguments in the center of the national American debate. And if you can't have those out here, where can you? Where is it actually safe to have them if not on a campus? So I want to close by sort of saying that my goal here is not to vindicate Trump, and it's not even ultimately to vindicate the actual particularity of the arguments advanced here, although I will defend them all. But it's to vindicate the absurdity that in the American intellectual environment, including the most elite sectors of American life, these arguments have been shunted out on the pretense that they are somehow beyond the pale. Beyond the pale. Trump is not an intellectual. Trump is ultimately, if you will, a business guy, an outsider, who articulates things more from instinct than he does from ideas. Now, this may seem like an indictment. It really isn't. If you had to go through American history, you could count on one hand the number of presidents who have articulated their view, you may say, ideologically or intellectually. FDR was a creature of instinct. Reagan was a creature of instinct. Lots of presidents ultimately operate on that level, but that is not to say that one can't make interesting, provocative, intellectual, and historical arguments for them. So I would urge you to, instead of dismissing our moment and basically saying, oh, there's a fascist in the White House, we've got to get him out, try to think about, what does this all mean? Where has American history actually brought us? I'll close on this. If we go not very far away from here in New York, or we go to Baltimore, a lot of these places where we've been seeing this urban unrest, clashes between cops and inner city kids. And, as a conservative, I'm supposed to defend the cops. But I don't really see it that way. When I look at these clashes, what I see is a dysfunctional urban environment. Broken families, dilapidated homes, a high degree of violence necessary to hold a place together, a kind of nihilism. And when I look at that, and I sort of itemize it in my head, I realize Those are exactly the features of the old slave plantation that the historian Kenneth Stamp outlines in his book called Slavery, a Peculiar Institution. In other words, slavery was a plantation in which the people who lived there were in a state of perpetual dependency from which they were never expected to get out. The Democrats would say slavery is a school of civilization. But if it was a school from which the students were never expected to graduate. And my point is that today, there are actually rather startling similarities between the old plantation and life in some of our inner cities. And by the way, not just for blacks. Barrios for Hispanics, reservations for Native Americans. And my point is, these are actually the creations of the Democratic Party. The same party that ran the old plantation is running the new ones. So it's worth asking whether this is being done for the benefit of the people who live there. I know we hear that, but isn't that what the slave owners said too? They too said, hey, slavery, we're doing it for the benefit of the slaves. It's a positive good. We're teaching these people the habits of civilization. You can't blame the Republican Party for Oakland, and you can't blame it for Baltimore, and you can't blame it for inner city Washington, D.C., because these are communities entirely run by Democrats. Democratic school boards, Democratic unions, Democratic mayors, Democratic city officials all the way through. So the Democratic Party needs to take some responsibility. Look, the Democrats have never once admitted their history. They have never once acknowledged it. They have never apologized for it. They have never taken responsibility for it. They have never paid 1 penny of reparations for it. This is the true scandal of American bigotry. We talk about bigotry endlessly. I've never even seen anyone ask that the Democrats show a modicum of accountability. Why blame the Republican Party? This is the party that produced emancipation and ended slavery. This is the party that passed the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. This is the party that fought segregation all the way. This is a party that ultimately helped get the civil rights movement through. What does the Republican Party have to apologize for on the issue of race? Trump has nothing to apologize for. If you can produce a racist record with Trump, do it. But you have no history behind you. The history is actually the weight of the history falls on his accusers, not on Trump. And so that's my point. We've seen a real big switch, but it's not a switch of voting. It's a switch of the blame. The blame has been cunningly moved over onto people. And this to me is a big lie. In fact, it's a double lie. It's a double lie because a normal lie is just a denial of a truth. Hey, Your Honor, I wasn't there. I didn't kill him. That's a lie. A double lie is if I can say, not only did I not do it, but you see that victim? He's to blame. He actually produced the shooting. So if you can not only get out of it, as the Democrats have, but foist the blame onto the very people who actually fought you all the way, I gotta hand it to you. That's an intellectual coup. And we've seen an intellectual coup, except now this intellectual coup is being blown. And it's being blown in part because one of the things that Trump represents is he doesn't respect the firm parameters of debate. Trump goes, everything's up for grabs. Let's argue about it. Let's fight about it. And on the campus, fighting about it should mean a fight of ideas. That's why I'm here at Columbia. Ultimately, it is to invite you into a project which is really a liberal project. Opening the American mind, demanding on your own campus a wider parameter of ideas, not being satisfied with the narrow nostrums that pass for truth, but are in reality the very opposite of the truth. Thank you very much.
We're going to have a Q&A session. Before you get up to ask a question, keep it under 30 seconds. Don't make a statement. And when you exit to go ask a question, go out this way. You can't come down here to exit. So it'll be up to your right in this direction. The mic will be right here.
Okay, let's get it going.
Thank you so much for bringing this talk. I just had a question because you mentioned this really important point that there's this entirely different history of the Democratic Party. And I'm just wondering, what are the reasons why that isn't represented in the mainstream media, especially because we have a significant chunk of Americans who obviously are trending away from that conventional narrative. So why isn't that represented in the mainstream media as much, do you think?
The question is, why don't we hear about this in the media? I think the answer is this, that in academia and in media and in Hollywood, all three, we have actually seen, I think, a very disturbing phenomenon. And I'll describe it in academia very briefly because I think it's the same thing as in the media. When I was a student at Dartmouth in the 80s, we had among the faculty two groups of people. We had an older group, I would call them the old liberals, classical liberals. And then we had a younger generation of activist professors. Many of them had gotten their politics shaped in the late 60s. And these two groups were kind of at loggerheads, and the older group kind of kept a certain modicum of balance on the campus. So conservatism, for example, was represented on campus. Even though most students were liberal, they knew what conservatives stood for and believed. I think today, if you go to Columbia and you ask a typical student, what is it that conservatives in America are trying to conserve? I think they'll be hard-pressed to say. Or if they are forced to say, they'll say something like, well, obviously it's going to be like bigotry or racism. So you don't even know what your opposition stands for, right? Now, so what's happened is that today when I speak on campus, that older generation that I had when I was a student is gone. And so a younger generation is now fully in charge, and it's self-perpetuating. Academia is a self-perpetuating institution. Hollywood is a small, incestuous place. It is also self-replicating. The only way Hollywood will become wider is if people make independent films outside of Hollywood. The media. Now, the media is not monolithic, but the so-called mainstream media is monolithic. And I think one of the reasons we've seen this explosion of new media and rebel media and crazy media is because the traditional channels of media have not been open. I mean, to give you an example, I make a movie last year, Hillary's America. Michael Moore makes a movie on Trump. Moore's movie is so bad that the theaters won't even take it. It was shown in a couple of theaters in New York, and if you went to see that movie, you'd realize you didn't have to buy a ticket. It was free. You just stand in line and go to the movie. That's because he couldn't sell a ticket. I make a movie which is the most successful documentary of 2016, the whole year, despite hundreds of movies being made that year. It's about the election. It's the 8th most successful political film of all time. It's in 1,200 theaters around the country. Now, if you're watching CBS, ABC, or NBC, no mention was made of this movie in the entire election campaign. No one even acknowledged it existed. So I say to you, what kind of media is it? You can't say it's because the topic isn't interesting or relevant or related to the election. Many people think our film had a critical role in helping defeat Hillary. So the movie is about the election. It raises a lot of issues, some of the issues I've talked about this evening, so they can't be irrelevant, and yet no mention. A complete, in a sense, ban on the movie. Now, it's not the old kind of ban, banned in Boston, the government passes a law, but it's an unspoken agreement among people who think the same way. They essentially think we're in the Hillary camp. It's our job to drag the crooked hag across the finish line. That's our task. So that's what they set about to do, and their actions are completely explained by this outrageous hypothesis. And no other hypothesis can explain it. So there you go. It's a closed world, unfortunately. That's bad for us as well. So what's going on in academia is bad, what's going on in media is bad. Trump instinctively knows this. He ultimately knows that the reason they hate his Twitter is not because he's out of control. He is out of control. But the real reason they don't like his Twitter is because if he didn't use Twitter, everything he said goes through the filter that's them. So Trump knows at some level that his only way to get past that is to go directly. So this is why I cheer Trump on in Twitter, not because I think he's always, I agree, but that doesn't concern me now. What concerns me is to break this logjam of opinion. So I hope we do that.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
Okay. First off, thank you for coming here. Basically, I wanted to say I feel like us as conservatives, we have a problem with, we could present all the facts that you just said, and the leftists won't listen to us because it doesn't matter what we say. Everybody who's a conservative is a racist. And I was wondering, do you think it's possible if we were somehow able to make a deal with Donald Trump that to basically, support his wall if he was able to legalize everybody here in the United States as long as they weren't the criminals who were, the murderers and all that? Do you think that would actually help heal something in America if somehow that was able to happen?
Your question actually contains two parts that are not really connected. Or at least if they are connected, it seems to me that what you're saying is that no matter what you say, you're branded a racist. So you've thought of a clever truce that, if implemented, might mollify your opponents and get them to see that you're not as bad as they previously portrayed you to be. Now, I must say that that is a very un-Trumpian sentiment, because I think Trump's insight is that the more that you talk like that, the more you actually embolden your opposition to brand you a racist. In other words, it's your vulnerability that eggs them on. What do you think about something? It makes no sense to accuse someone of being a racist who really is. Who really is. I'm an Indian. Can you imagine if someone grabbed me by the lapels and go, "You're an Indian"? I'd go, "Yeah, so? What's the big deal?" Right? It's only when you think someone is not a racist that the charge has a sting. And then you go, "You're a racist." And the guy goes, "No, I'm not, no, I'm not." And he's up against the wall. He's on the defensive. Why? Because internally, he must have a moral code that's anti-racist, and the accuser must know it and is counting on it. Now, let me say this. I don't know a solution to the immigration problem. I'm in general pro-immigration. I'm a legal immigrant myself. My wife's an immigrant from Venezuela. We've thought of all kinds of ways to address the problem of immigrants who are law-abiding, and even illegals who have been here but have been living by the laws. It's not entirely their fault that they're here. It's partly their fault. They are lawbreakers. But there's been a collusion with business and a collusion with people who have let them here, and we haven't enforced our laws, so there's a lot of blame to go around. One possible solution is for some of those people, yes, you can stay in America. Perhaps, yes, you can become a citizen, but no, you can't vote. You can't vote because you didn't come here on the same deal as everyone else who did and came by the rules. So there is a way to find ways that you can stay, and perhaps even enjoy the benefits of citizenship, except, and that's probably a bargain, quite honestly, that the immigrants can live with. Now, it's probably not a bargain that the Democratic Party would want. And that brings part of the reason why there hasn't been an immigration agreement of any kind is that there are lots of people in the immigration debate who aren't about the immigrants at all. They have another agenda. Back to your point about racism, part of what I've been doing tonight is really stripping away the race card and the moral indignation that comes out of a set of propositions about race that turn out to be false. If it is true that historically the Klan has been some kind of an arm of the Republican Party, then you could say, well, gee, it's not surprising the Republicans nominated Trump. After all, they've always been the party of the Klan. But no, the Republican Party is not the party of the Klan. So we need to rethink our assumptions, and that's a long process. No one changes their mind overnight. And this is only a first step. Okay, next question.
Okay, so you said earlier that from your analysis, there's not any racist history with Donald Trump. He's a New Yorker, he has New York values. In the press during the campaign, there were accusations that he and his father were discriminating against black people in his properties when he was focused on the real estate market. Do you want to address that claim?
Sure. The discrimination laws in America since the 1960s can be interpreted in two ways and actually have two completely separate meanings. The first is what you would call discrimination in the old sense. Discrimination in the old sense is something like this. A white guy and a black guy apply for a job. the black guy is better qualified, the white guy gets the job. That is discrimination in the classic sense, right? In other words, you have the more qualified guy should get the job, the more qualified guy is African American, but the white guy gets the job even though he's less qualified. That's classic discrimination. If you actually look at housing discrimination suits, real estate lawsuits today, I would submit to you that out of 100 in the country, less than 5 are of that nature. Most of the discrimination suits in America today have to do with statistics. And statistics the argument goes something like this. At Walmart in Tulsa, Oklahoma, African Americans are 8% of the surrounding population, but they are only 4% of employees at Walmart. Therefore, Walmart is discriminating, and the EEOC will file, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, in conjunction with the Justice Department, will file a lawsuit. Now, I want to emphasize that this may be true or false, but it doesn't have anything to do with discrimination in the classic sense. What essentially is, there's an underlying assumption of proportional representation. And when that proportionality is violated, there's a presumption of discrimination and a burden on the part of the employer, or in this case the contractor, to prove why there is a numerical discrepancy between the ambient population and your workforce. If you look at the Trump lawsuits to look at what is the basis of the proof that he discriminated, you have foremen that said, blacks don't need to apply over here. We're not hiring any blacks. First of all, try getting away with something like this in New York City. It would be the death knell of Trump's company to even move in this direction. Most large companies have been sued for discrimination. Virtually no company is, over the past 30 years, completely exempt. Almost all companies have adopted various affirmative action plans in settlement of these suits. Sometimes the suits are for the purpose of getting those plans into place. I only mention this to say, to me, this is not a closed issue. This is an issue that if you want to make a case, you have to go into the concreteness of the evidence. It's not enough to say, hey, the Justice Department filed a suit, therefore Trump is discriminating. That is only the beginning of the inquiry and not the end of it. So look into it some more.
Can I raise another question?
Sure, but just be brief.
Yeah, there was another case where Trump wasn't involved, but it was the Central Park 5 case where 5 black people were charged with rape. After a series of trials, they were eventually acquitted. They found the actual rapist in the case. And even after that acquittal and after they found the actual rapist, Trump continually said that those 5 black people did the crime and should be in jail. Now, to anyone who passes law, that would be erroneous. There's always a criminal who's been in jail for this. They didn't do the crime. Why are we dragging this case on? The explanation that anyone had in the media was that Trump is making a racist charge. Do you want to address that?
I wish I knew more about it. If it is the case that Trump knowingly said that, he would be culpable for doing it. That would be no defense, no excuse for that. Trump does shoot his mouth off. There's no question about it. He says things that he doesn't know much about. When he was first hit with these white supremacist groups, normally in politics, people have a certain degree of innate caution, which is the result of knowing that you're walking in a minefield, right? Now, if you bring in an outsider like Trump, it's going to come with pluses and minuses. Remember, no outsider, and by outsider I mean someone who's not a senator, not a governor, has been elected president since Eisenhower, who was the supreme commander of World War II and very diplomatic. With Trump, you're getting, in a way, an outsider who brings, in some ways, the refreshing candor, openness, and sort of outrageousness of it, but with some liabilities. And I think, and the one question about Trump in the presidency is what will he learn when he's on the job? And we'll have to wait and see. But again, I don't know enough about that particular incident, so I can't address it specifically.
So you mentioned a lot of democratic history where mention of Democrats have been historically, I don't know if you would word it pro-slavery, but have been the ones who were proponents of slavery in the United States. And it almost appears as if that history is, the argument being made is that that history should support whether or not Democrats are allowed to use the term bigotry in one way or another, but Donald Trump has, in one particular instance, I'll bring up the very controversial video of him with Billy Bush, where he has said something that was, yes, more than 10 years ago, but that a lot of people interpret to mean that he is sexist and that he does not have respect for women. But the argument of many Trump supporters was that, oh, it's more than 10 years old, it's not relevant anymore, he's no longer like that. How would you say that those two things can be rationalized then?
Well, first of all, I've never either rationalized or defended Trump's statement on that matter. Never. Now, that being said, I do think that there is a difference between the private sphere and actions conducted in the public domain and in the public trust that have actually imposed real, we're talking not just hardship. I mean, to call slavery a hardship is an understatement, right? To call segregation a hardship is an understatement. We're talking about official, governmental, state policies enforced by sheriffs with dogs. So, even if you compared Trump with Hillary, the crimes alleged against Hillary, for example, the Clinton Foundation, were conducted, Bill is the ex-president, Hillary is the sitting Secretary of State. Bill is the UN delegate for assigning aid to Haiti. Hillary is the Secretary of State through which American aid is passing. These are people in the public domain and in the public trust. So there is a different level of scrutiny to what someone does in the private sphere. So that's the only point I want to make. And the reason in making these, it's always important to put these things in their proper place. So yes, there's no excuse for private comments. However, in whatever dorm room or frat room atmosphere they were made, they still are in the public sphere. He still is running for president. It's a legitimate topic of scrutiny. But it's not the same thing as Andrew Jackson, who is a military general who is killing Indians and throwing them off their land so that his own private surveyors can come on that land and buy it at below market prices. That's a totally different deal and has a totally different effect on real lives. So that's the only point I would make, even though it was much longer ago.
And could I ask one more thing? So also, when you were talking about the history of the Democratic Party, you mentioned how most people or all people who were pro-slavery were Democrats, but then how would you explain the Southern strategy where, as the dismantling of the Jim Crow laws came to be, many Republicans pushed the party far more right in encouraging those who were historically Democratic voters with certain ideals that were racist and appealing to those who were racist, who were Democratic, to vote for Republicans?
This is a very good question about the Southern strategy. The Southern strategy as described and as popularly understood is a total and complete fiction. And the proof of it is very simple. Ask yourself this question. Richard Nixon is alleged to have made racist appeals to Southern Democrats to become Republicans. I defy you to give me a single public example. Richard Nixon in private, and we know this from the Watergate tapes, would mutter all kinds. He was a paranoid man who had all kinds of prejudices and hatreds. I don't deny that for a minute. That was the private Nixon. But in order to show a Southern strategy, it's not enough to show that Nixon is muttering in private. You have to show that if he's going to make racist appeals to Southern whites to vote for the Republican Party, you have to produce those. And no one has ever produced a single one. So the point is, this Southern strategy has been alleged later. And in fact, it's so effective that a dumb chairman of the Republican National Committee was apologizing for the Southern strategy, even though there was no Southern strategy of the kind described. Now, having said that, Nixon did have a strategy. What was his strategy? Nixon's strategy was ultimately to use blacks in his favor against the racist Democrats. Proof, Nixon was the first person to implement affirmative action. Where did he do it? In Philadelphia. How did he do it? He went to the racist unions, all white, which did not admit blacks, and he basically said, if you don't admit blacks, I'm cutting off federal contracts from you. And the white racist unions were forced to admit blacks, and that's the first actual case of affirmative action in the United States implemented by one Richard Milhouse Nixon. This was his actual strategy, pro-black, against the racist Democrats. Now, Lyndon B. Johnson had a Southern strategy, and that was a more complicated matter. How do you keep blacks who have traditionally voted Republican in the Democratic Party? LBJ could see that the Southerners were moving in the Republican camp, not because of racism, because of the 60s. The anti-war movement, patriotism, a lot of issues were in play. And LBJ's point was, we need the blacks. If we can't keep the blacks, the Democratic Party is not viable in the South. He had a Southern strategy. So, bottom line, it's a complex story. But this whole idea that the Republicans made racist appeals, check it out for yourself. You have to locate those appeals. If you can't find those appeals, it's pure fiction to say appeals were made, although I don't have any examples. Because how else to tell people to vote, hey, racists, come vote Republican? If you can't find that, you don't have a case. And there is no case. Okay.
Hi, Mr. D'Souza. Thank you for coming. I appreciate that you came to speak to us, especially at a very liberal campus like Columbia. My question regards your argument. You basically, I think, conflate liberalism and progressivism with the Democratic Party. You say things like Woodrow Wilson, who was a racist, is as an example of why liberalism is part of the democratic dialogue even today, right? What I will say is Woodrow Wilson is now the object of ire for many liberal campuses, especially Princeton. You said, for example, that Stephen Douglas, who is a Northern Democrat, said that we should leave the decision of whether states should have slaves to the states. Is that not a conservative principle? And finally, you also said that as racism has decreased in the South, republicanism has increased. That's a correlation without a causation, right? Those things don't imply one another. So what I'll say is, if, for example, right, the principles of a party change, right, if the Democratic Party, if the ideals under them become more progressive over time, why are you vilifying the Democratic Party? And I would ask you not to address the historical specifics, but rather the idea that you're conflating liberalism and the Democratic Party. Certainly. Well, number one, Woodrow Wilson was not merely a Democrat. He is acknowledged to be the founding father of modern American progressivism. Woodrow Wilson is the first progressive. Now, Teddy Roosevelt flirted with progressivism. He did that after he quit the Republican Party, and he ran on the Bull Moose progressive ticket, but lost. Woodrow Wilson is the first progressive to be president as a progressive. His presidency is distinguished by a number of things very characteristic of progressives today. For example, no president prior to Woodrow Wilson had ever attacked the American founders, had ever said that the founding is out of date, that we need a new way of looking at America. Woodrow Wilson invented that. He started that. And that all the talk we hear today about the living Constitution, the datedness of the founders, the prejudice against the founders, none of that occurred in America, not even in the Democratic Party, before Woodrow Wilson. So to identify Woodrow Wilson as a progressive is absolutely dead-on accurate. Now, I'm not saying that Woodrow Wilson's progressivism is the same as the progressivism of today. For example, Woodrow Wilson, for example, was a social Darwinist. Woodrow Wilson believed that if you have, in his view, useless people, this was sort of the ideology shared by Woodrow Wilson, Margaret Sanger, the progressives of the late teens and 20s, believe that what you do with useless people is you kill them or you prevent them from being born. And so people like Wilson signed sterilization laws. They put into effect statutes to kill off useless people, or in Sanger's view, try to prevent them from existing in the first place. Obviously, progressives have broken with that social Darwinist ideology. When did they do it? They only did it after World War II, when this same progressive ideology was adopted by the Nazis, who put into place, long before the Nuremberg laws, long before the concentration camps, the Nazis were killing off imbeciles, they were killing off diabetics, they were killing off people with all kinds of physical ailments, criminals. They were doing exactly what Wilson and Margaret Sanger advocated. This, again, is a fact. There was close exchanges between Nazi eugenicists and Americans. The Americans invented all the ideas that the Nazis implemented and put into place.
And this was acknowledged by the Nazis themselves and by the Americans. After World War II, the whole subject became taboo, because with the horror of the concentration camps, social Darwinism became a bad word. Very interestingly, Richard Hofstadter, an honorable, not alumnus, but professor at Columbia, wrote a book, Social Darwinism in America. It's a very interesting book. It's kind of regarded as a kind of classic, but to me it's a classic example of deception. If you read that book innocently now today, you would think that social Darwinism historically is all about laissez-faire capitalism. That the real social Darwinists were actually business guys in America. Most business guys had never heard of Darwin. They had nothing to do with social Darwinism. Essentially, Hofstadter's book is based upon two social Darwinists, one of them British. William Graham Sumner was at Yale, so he was the American. So social Darwinism was taken from a killing machine, which is what it became, it was mythically transformed into an advocacy of free markets. This was done deliberately to cover up the progressive actual death record prior to World War II. So what I'm getting at is, I'm saying that we have to look at history very skeptically. Very skeptically. FDR had all kinds of praise for Mussolini. Young JFK went to Nazi Germany. I'm not talking about in the 30s, in 1945, and came back praising Hitler. This is JFK. Now, again, we don't know it. We never hear about it. I'm happy to prove it. But we don't hear about it because the progressives after World War II said, we don't want our young people learning about any of this. Because if they did, our heroes, FDR, JFK, Woodrow Wilson, will become besmirched. I don't even want to get started on FDR. I will if I need to, but I want to give other people a chance. Very briefly.
Again, I understand how, the sort of racist underpinnings of Woodrow Wilson and many other people, like the social Darwinism thing that you're discussing. Those things may have been part of progressivism, but they're not the whole of progressivism. For you to condemn all of progressive ideals based on a part that has evolved, right, and the Democratic Party has consequently let go of, how is it that you can say and condemn the Democratic Party and progressivism as a whole because of a part of its history that it has let go of, and that now is greatly touted by the Republican Party, people like David Duke who support Donald Trump? Is there no distinction here? I'm just wondering.
Well, all right, let's be fair about it. Let's take David Duke, and let's take the guy I mentioned earlier, Robert Byrd. When David Duke called himself a Republican, the entire Republican Party with a unified voice said no. They threw him out. He has never been accepted as a Republican, even though he keeps insisting he is. Byrd was lionized in the Democratic Party. When he died, Hillary made a video praising him. He has never been held account. Never once did Byrd ever say, I used to be in the Klan. It was a horrible mistake. I've had a dark night of the soul. I've had a transformation of consciousness. When Whittaker Chambers left the Communist Party, he wrote a 400-page book describing his intellectual and moral journey. That's the least you could ask for the Democratic Party. If it's actually going to say, yeah, we did all that, but we're different now, where's the moral accounting for it? Who has ever taken which Democrat has ever said, I admit that our party has been the party of slavery, segregation, Jim Crow, and the Klan? Has any Democrat ever said that? No. So it's hard to sort of exonerate these guys from responsibility when they won't take responsibility. It'd be one thing if they did and explain how they've changed. Now, I'm not indicting all of progressivism. I'm merely indicting that segment of progressivism that is playing the race card on the Republicans. And I'm simply saying that on this critical moral issue, without the race card, the moral power of the Democratic Party would collapse. In fact, all the civil rights movements in America have piggybacked on the race one. The feminist movement built on the civil rights movement. The gay rights movement is built on the feminist movement. So the civil rights supplied the original moral capital of the Democratic Party. It is its moral claim to rule. So all I'm saying is, for this particular evening, I'm trying to take that card away. And you seem to be saying, yes, but we've done some other good stuff. No, let's just move on, if you don't mind.
Actually, guys,
Okay. We're just going to take two more questions. Be really brief. I'm sorry, but I'm being cut off. So we have a limit of time. Go ahead. Yes, let's take. Go ahead.
I actually wanted to ask a question about Trump's economic policies. I'm originally from Brazil. I was raised in Brazil, although I'm a U.S. citizen. In 2014, if you were a Brazilian and you bought you bought U.S. dollars and lost money in the exchange rate, bought a plane ticket from Rio de Janeiro to New York City, bought an iPhone in the American Apple Store, and went back to Brazil. Doing all that was cheaper than buying an actual iPhone in the Brazilian Apple Store. Now, if protectionist policies, much like the policy that Trump wants to implement here in the States, failed in Brazil and failed in every other country, please explain to me why protectionist policies would work here in the United States.
It's a very good question. I don't think, believe it or not, that Donald Trump is, in fact, a protectionist. And let me say what I mean by that. There are two types of protectionism. One type of protectionism is, I'm going to impose tariffs on foreign goods because I want to save American jobs. That's classic protectionism. Here's another kind of protectionism that's not protectionism at all. I think we should have open trade and a level playing field. But the world is not like that. In fact, Japanese car makers can sell their cars in America with no tariffs, or virtually no tariffs. We can't sell our cars over there without being slapped with a heavy tariff. Now the question becomes, what do you do about that? Milton Friedman would say, you do nothing. Because from an economic point of view, you're still better off not having a double tariff. If they have tariffs and we have tariffs, that's two sets of tariffs, and that's really bad. But that is a purely econometric way of thinking. A political way of thinking goes, yeah, but then it provides no incentive whatever to the guys who are putting tariffs abroad to take down their tariffs. But what if we were to say to them, hey guys, you've had a really good time selling cars in America and we really want you to continue. However, as long as you have tariffs on our products, we're going to put tariffs on your products in order to pressure you to take yours down. This is very similar to something that Abraham Lincoln did in the Civil War. It came to his attention that the Confederates were shooting free blacks who were captured by the Confederacy. These are free blacks fighting in the Union Army. Now, whites who were captured were not killed. They were just imprisoned and held as prisoners of war. Lincoln issued an executive order that basically said this: for every free black who is caught and executed by the Confederacy, one Confederate soldier will be summarily shot. Now, by itself, this is an order of unimaginable barbarity and contravenes all the rules of war. You can't summarily shoot prisoners. But Lincoln's point was, how else to stop the Confederacy from the barbaric things that they are doing if I don't do this? And sure enough, they stopped. Point I'm trying to make, and I don't mean the analogy literally, but I think you see what I'm saying. For a political man to say, in a bargaining sense, and particularly this seems to me to be kind of a New York move, is to basically say to those guys, I don't want tariffs, guys, but I'm not going to sit by and have you stick all these beautiful tariffs on your products and expect me not to respond in kind. So I don't think that that is a protectionist view. From a purely economic point of view, it is. But if its real goal is the removal of tariffs, then to me it can be completely justified on libertarian economic free trade grounds. Which kind of protectionist Trump is might become more clear over the next 4 years. I'm simply saying, from what Trump has said now, it's not clear to me that Trump is a protectionist in the classic sense. Okay? All right, last question. Or maybe both of you can ask and I'll close out. Go ahead.
So I just had a few questions about statements that you've made with regard to earlier questions.
Can I make a suggestion just because of time?
Yeah. All right.
Since you want to obviously hit me with 7 things,
All
you're
right.
less likely to succeed on 7. Why don't you pick the best one?
Okay. So in your the question about discrimination, you said classical discrimination is where there are two equally worthy candidates and one is not provided the same opportunity as the other simply because of race. In the suit against Trump's organization, that is exactly what was alleged, that civil rights groups sent black applicants for units and white applicants in for units with the same exact applications and noted that systematically the black applicants were not told that there were any availabilities, and white applicants were admitted in. So isn't that, by your definition, classical discrimination?
It is, but I do notice that you said alleged as opposed to proven, right? You said it was alleged, and in fact, in most discrimination cases, there are allegations. Now, the problem with a lot of these suits, as you know, is that they're settled. And they're settled, they become a money transaction as opposed to a proving transaction. So the truth, quite honestly, may never be known. I don't know what was alleged as opposed to what was proven, but to my knowledge, the classic discrimination I described was not proven against Trump. Okay. Are you saying the contrary?
In a court of law, you're right, that it was settled. But nevertheless, this group does have documented evidence of black applicants being treated differently from white applicants, ostensibly only because of the color of their skin.
But
so,
you would agree that...
No, I agree that it's not, in the court of law, the government allowed for a settlement to take place instead. But I think we can all recognize that although we are a system, we are a nation of laws, when a black applicant is documented as not receiving the same treatment as a white applicant when their applications are identical, that is still, to the layperson.
Hey, trust me, that's prima facie discrimination. I'm not denying that for a minute. And second of all, you'll never hear me.
You were denying it, though.
Well, no. I was simply saying that in order to make a sustainable claim against somebody, something has to be juridically resolved. Just to say that there was an allegation and there was, because to listen to one side of just about every case, you would find it convincing until you hear the other side, right? And I didn't even rhapsodize about the nation of laws, believe me. As somebody who served 8 months of overnight confinement in the legal system, I have a very jaundiced view of the nation of laws. I believe, for example, that lots of innocent people are in fact convicted, and our legal system is very far from what it ought to be. Not just on racial grounds, on all kinds of other grounds. So you'll never hear that from me these days. But what I am saying is, it seems to me, look, we're in a new environment now with regard to race in America. To say something like, I found a white supremacist who endorses Trump. Anyone who knows American history realizes how different that is from saying that the Ku Klux Klan as an organization was an arm of the Democratic Party. Here's what I mean. We live in a society today where the Ku Klux Klan is basically defunct. The Ku Klux Klan cannot rally in any part of America now without being outnumbered 10-1 by anti-Klan protesters who will shut that thing down in 15 minutes. So the Klan is not today a real force. But the Klan used to be a real force. The Klan used to have its own Democratic primaries. In other words, you couldn't get the Democratic nomination. Two Klansmen would run against each other for the Klan endorsement that guy then became the Democratic nominee. This is when the Klan had real power. In 1924, for example, there were 50,000 Klansmen marching up and down New York City. And the Democratic Party voted on a resolution of whether or not to condemn the Klan. The resolution failed. This is at the New York DNC convention of 1924. So this is our actual history. What you're talking about now are basically toothless ragtag guys who have no influence on American politics. They really don't matter. Half of them are attention seekers. These are not real Nazis and they're not real Klansmen. In fact, if they actually tried to join the Nazi party, they would probably be sent to the gas chambers. So most of these guys are actually complete losers. And should not be confused with when racism and these terrorist organizations had real power. Okay, last question.
Thank you very much for coming, and I'm an international student at Columbia University. So recently I watched your documentary films. I really had an eye-opening moment. So I want to ask you, as a very successful immigrant, how can we help people like me from a poor background and come to this point and who want to genuinely become a part of American citizen in future, who wanted to contribute to this country? Do we need to have fear on the Trump era?
in my opinion, no. When you look at the press accounts of today, I just saw one today. Trump order sends wave of fear among thousands of immigrants. There is an almost either ignorant or willful conflation between legal and illegal immigrants. In fact, to be honest, even the term illegal immigrant is misleading, because if someone is illegal, they're not an immigrant. They're just an illegal, right? Now, the thing to remember here is that all this stuff about, let's take it to the court, we all, by virtue of being human, have natural rights, a la John Locke. But our civil rights are the result of a social compact that citizens make mutually by coming together in a society. You and I, if we become naturalized citizens, we become part of this social compact. The rights of the American Constitution apply only to US citizens. There's no such thing as an alien having constitutional rights, whether First Amendment or Second Amendment or any other. They don't have those rights. This is not to say they have no rights at all. I'm simply saying they don't have constitutional rights. Now, Trump, in my view, defends a certain Americanism that is very cosmopolitan, very diverse, and driven by immigrants. But part of his point is it violates that pact to allow unlawful entry that jumps the fence, so to speak, and then proclaims indignantly the same rights as everybody else. That is actually a kind of deceit being foisted on our system. And it's putting us in the position of being the reluctant expellers of people who don't belong in our club. We never agreed to let them in. They actually kind of broke their way in, you might say, and are now insisting that they are indistinguishable from every other immigrant who has actually come a completely different way. So to me, the difference between the legal and the illegal is critical here. Now, this is not to say that we don't have any compassion or even moral obligations to refugees, but again, these have to be subordinate to security interests of the country. I mean, think back to John Locke. Why do we have a government? Primarily to protect us from foreign and domestic thugs. That's the government's first job. No other job is important if it isn't doing that job. So Trump, I think, is on very strong ground in saying things like, you know, I'm going to put security first. I'm going to insist upon real vetting. Now, I teach as part of my community service Hispanic adults English. There is fear among them. Where are they getting this fear? They're getting it from Univision and Telemundo. Because Jorge Ramos and all his buddies are scaring the immigrants and basically saying things like, make sure you carry your belongings in a backpack because immigration might be waiting for you when you show up at Walmart. This is not happening, this is not true, but the fear is part of a political weapon that's being used right now against Trump. So again, what will Trump actually do? We'll wait and see. But so far, to me, Trump has done nothing. I don't think he will do anything. I feel no sense of fear as an immigrant. And the crackdown on illegals pales before what Obama was doing systematically. Part of what happens in our politics is because we think Obama's one kind of a guy. Obviously, whatever he was doing is fine. Trump is a really bad guy, so even if he's doing the same thing, it's Trump. No, you kind of have to look at what's actually happening and how it's going to play out. So the bottom line of it is, it seems to me that I voted for Trump, or at least I would have voted for Trump if I could have voted. If Trump pardons me, I will be able to vote. And I can vote for him next time. But the point I want to make is, to me...
I think it's unfair to you for the president.
Well, thank you. But my point was just this. To me, there are two views of America. And very briefly, I will call them the ladder and the rope. Ladders of opportunity, that's the Republican Party. You climb the ladder. The government has a job to hold the ladder. The rope is the Democratic approach, which is basically, we Democrats at the top of a tall building, we're going to let down a rope. You hang on, we'll pull you up. So the rope is more appealing than the ladder because the ladder involves work. You have to climb. The rope, you only have to hold on. But it dawned on me early in my career that while the rope is easier, the truth of it is you're always beholden to the guy holding the rope. If he lets you go, down you go. And then I noticed that lots of people who are being pulled up never get pulled all the way up. They never become self-sufficient. They're always hanging. And then it crossed my mind that maybe the people who are holding the rope prefer them to remain hanging because they remain in a position of beholdenness politically. And if they ever scrambled onto the shore, they might dust off and walk off. Who needs the Democratic Party? So it may be, at the end of the day, and this is what I tell my students as well, you have to choose. Do you want the ladder or do you want the rope? And at the end of the day, we have to make our own choice. Listen, guys, I actually expected a stormier presence at Columbia. This has been a very civil conversation. I want to thank you for your respectfulness and cordiality. Think about the things I said. I appreciate your coming. Thank you.
If we could sit down, we're gonna do one thing for Dinesh. We want to thank Young America's Foundation. Without them, we wouldn't have this opportunity, have this great prominent speaker. We also like to thank campus security and all the people that helped out on this event. It wouldn't be possible without them. Also, on March 9th, we're co-hosting the New York City Primary Mayoral Forum, which will have 4 political candidates, and please come. It'll be a lot of fun, a lot of news, and you'll probably have an opportunity to meet some of these people who actually could be the New York City mayor. So we want them already.
Thanks for coming, everyone. I also encourage some of you to stay after for a few minutes. Dinesh is actually going to be filming a short clip about Hillary's America, his film that was nominated for the 37th Golden Raspberry Awards, or the Razzie Awards. So if you want to be a part of that, I encourage you to stay. Thank you so much for coming.